Welcome. Really good to have everybody here. I know more people will be showing up. They always do. So, Phil, take it away.
Okay, thank you. Um, my eyes are pretty sensitive to the light right now, so I'll see if we can pull this off. Um, this reflection was inspired by a passage from Anne Frank that triggered me. Um, so I'm adding myself and a little bit of Howard Zinn to that. I sometimes think of myself as a pathological optimist. I grew up an idealist in an idealist family. I was Quaker before I was born, and the Quaker belief system is ingrained in me to my very core. I became an activist, an advocate, and a protester of inhumane social phenomena, and began a career in the helping professions. However, when I hit the real world head on in my late teens and early 20s and got a good dose of history, sociology, and hard knocks, it challenged me. One of my sociology professors admonished me early in my academic career that when writing papers in sociology, I need to focus on what is real and not what I wish was real. I went on to immerse myself in sociology, undergraduate and graduate, majoring in sociology and history. Certainly enough material in sociology and history there to kill an idealist. I did some uh, teaching in sociology, college level, and I did some high school, secondary teaching in history and social studies. Um, anyway, I was teaching 11th grade history at the time of the Martin Luther King Jr. assassination. This was in rural Northern California, and even allowing for that, I was shocked to learn of the ignorance and indifference of my students. Kind of became aware that most of my students had probably never seen a Black person and were really unaware of current events, and they could no way they could walk around in the shoes of a Black person. I went on from there with a uh, career in social services where I had to balance my optimism with some harsh realities. So where am I going with this? I have come to view my liberal optimism and idealism with a lot of skepticism. I know from my academic and real life experience uh, that life is not often as we would like to see it. And I ran across this quote from Anne Frank, which I would like to share with you. And fortunately, it's in bigger print, so that might help better. I really wonder that I haven't dropped all my ideals because they seem so absurd and impossible to carry out. Yet I keep them because, in spite of everything, I still believe that people are really good at heart. I simply can't build my hopes on a foundation of confusion, misery, and death. I see the world gradually being turned into a wilderness. I hear the approaching thunder. I can feel the suffering of millions. And yet, if I look up into the heavens, I think that it will all come out all right one of these days, that this cruelty will end and that peace will and tranquility will ultimately prevail. And here's something I discovered after I started this little project from Howard Zinn that kind of nails it too. To be hopeful in bad times is based on the fact that human history is not only of cruelty, but also of compassion, sacrifice, courage, and kindness. If we see only the worst, it destroys our capacity to do something. If we remember those times and places where people have behaved magnificently, this gives us the energy to act. And if we do act, in however small a way, we don't have to wait for some grand utopian future. The future is an infinite succession of presents, and to live now as we think human beings should live, in defiance of all that is bad around us, is itself a marvelous victory. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Phil.
Um,
Thanks for those thoughts.
Yeah. And take care of your eyes. Okay, introducing themselves, Anthony and then Sophia. Welcome.
Good morning, everybody. I'm sorry to have missed Phil's reflection. I was just needing to sleep in a little bit today. But I'm Anthony Manousis. I'm with Interfaith Communities United for Justice. I'm on the board. I'm also the co-founder of Making Housing and Community Happen, a housing justice nonprofit, and on the general board of Friends Committee on National Legislation.
All right, Sophia.
Good morning, Sophia Quinones, LA Boyle Heights Coalition, and I hope you're all doing well. I had trouble getting in today. Thank you, Steve, for sending me the link. I appreciate it. And looking forward to today's plática.
All right, I believe that's everybody except our speaker. And Rick, you're going to introduce him. So I hope you're there. I don't see your face.
I am. Your technical person is having some technical issues, so I hope it gets better for everybody. The United Nations is a body that all of us know about, and what's been really great is that for a long time, for years, there have been these United Nations associations all over the world. And they've been ways for citizens in those countries to be able to engage with the work of the body and be able to help carry the goals of the United Nations into other into their communities. And someone that's been doing a lot of great work around that is Barry Simon, who has been working with us a long time. And along with doing this work, he's been an active member of Rotary International, who I'm very amazed that they've been doing so much work around communicating and peacemaking efforts. And I think that's probably worthy of another program if we can do it. He's a member and past president of the United Nations Association of the USA for Southern California. And he currently is serving the United Nations Association on the National Council, assisting and supporting membership and leadership development of U.N.A. members throughout the U.S. He also has another project called Conversations for Peace. And it's a project giving people around the world an opportunity to express themselves, be heard, understood, and appreciated. And the guests are invited to share what would be possible in their community, in the nation, and in the world if people could all get along. What would that be like? What would that make available? And it's interesting because there are certain points in history where that's an idea that is more fantastical than other times. And I think one of the things we need to do is keep on making sure that we have that optimism. So that's one reason why I wanted to invite Barry Simon and talk about his work with those entities. So, Barry, the floor is yours, and everybody else, please go on mute.
Rick, thank you very much for that nice introduction and that nice welcome. It's nice to meet all of you, and I'm especially honored to be speaking to the ICUJP today. I've heard about it, read about it a little bit from time to time, and to be invited to present to you today is just a real honor and privilege, and I appreciate all of you. You know, we all have busy lives, and there's lots of things you could be doing this morning and every Friday for 20 plus years, and you've chosen to be here as part of your stand for what I'll call a world that works for everyone, with no one and no thing left behind. And so even in your introductions, Steve, that I met, Steve, when were you president of the ACLU?
I think 1994 for 3 years.
Yeah, so it was around that time that I had started doing something called Barry. My middle name is Wayne, and I had started producing Barry Wayne's venting events. And we did a venting event every month at a cafe off of Main Street here in Santa Monica, where I live. And the purpose of the venting event was to allow people to come together. I had tried a little bit of stand-up comedy previous to that. I'm actually a stockbroker by profession and have been for 30 plus years. But on the side, my real passion has been the possibility of a world that works for everyone. And I didn't really want to be funny all the time, as a stand-up comic needs to be. So I thought I would create a event where people could come together, express their views on issues of the day, and leave hopefully feeling a little better, even though nothing was necessarily resolved. And so Barry Wayne's venting events were created and were highlighted on CNN at one point. And then I did one right before the George Bush, Al Gore elections. And that was going to be at the Skirball Cultural Center. It was the first time I was charging an admission. And I had numerous, what I'll call guest venters lined up. I was worried about an overflow crowd. And the Skirball and another organization, B'nai B'rith International, was supposed to have done a major mailing about the event, and hardly anybody showed up. And I made a conclusion that here I go again with a great idea that nobody's interested in. And I put it on the back burner. And a few years later, I did something at the Lincoln Memorial called Speak Out America. Similar idea. I had a table set up outside of right by the Lincoln Memorial and gave people an opportunity to come up to our camera and express their views on issues. And that was during the Bush administration, and people were more paranoid. And here in Los Angeles, if somebody sees a camera, it's like a magnet. They come to it. Oh, what are you doing? What are you doing? Do you need anybody? But in Washington, it was like, you know, they were a little more hesitant. That evolved over the years to Conversations for Peace. Growing up as a middle-class Jewish kid in Portland, Oregon, the son of a furniture salesman, you know, my parents were always involved in community service. I remember helping my dad set up a stamp where you could put the letters into a stamp and then stamp the date of a meeting on postcards and be able to send out postcards to the members of an organization to attend the next meeting. So I was a Cub Scout and a Boy Scout. And, you know, my mom went neighbor door to door during Halloween, collecting money for UNICEF and all those kinds of things. So that was kind of what I was raised with. And so for me to be involved in some form of expression for the possibility of a better world was kind of natural. And it wasn't that I suddenly got introduced to. Although in 1976, when I did something called the EST training, and I heard about the idea of the possibility of a world that works for everyone, that's who I was. And so it was a total perfect fit. And I've been involved in their programs ever since. I've also been a longtime participant at Agape. I think Dr. Ruby mentioned Agape. I used to go every Monday, every Sunday, and every Wednesday without fail. In fact, one time I bought a car, which an hour after I bought the car, I hated it. And I went to Agape that night, and the first note on the piano when they started a song, I was crying. And I thought, eventually I got to the place of realizing, Barry, it's just a car. If you don't like it, sell it. But Agape has always been very moving place for me, and very welcoming, no matter of one's background, faith, color, religion, etc. So I'm also reminded by somebody's comments in the introductions about if you want to shorten your Christmas gift list, talk politics at Thanksgiving. So, be that as it may, I'm a longtime person interested in the community and the world. I became involved with the United Nations Association in 2005, although my first experience at the UN was as a member of B'nai B'rith International with a small group of people in Washington, D.C., visiting various ambassadors right after Hamas had won the elections to be the representative of the Palestinians. And as representatives of B'nai B'rith, we visited, I personally with 3 others visited the ambassador of Ireland, Great Britain, Italy, Ethiopia, and Pakistan. And we had the same question for all of them. The PLO already had observer status at the UN, and they had also acknowledged Israel's right to exist. When Hamas won the elections, our concern was, will Hamas, and our question to the ambassadors, if Hamas requests that same PLO being an observer, and they're avowed for the elimination of a member state, how would you vote, Mr. Ambassador? And their answer is what disgusted me about diplomacy. They all said, has Hamas made that request? No, not yet. Well, we can't speculate. I'm sorry. If somebody were to say, we want to kill so-and-so, and you don't have an opinion about whether that's right or wrong. So it was really kind of annoying that particular view, and that was in 2004. In 2005, I was invited to help the UN Association in Pasadena with their 60th anniversary of the UN event. And they liked me. I helped with that event. They liked me, invited me to be on their board. And my role with the UN Association has flourished since then. I'll backstep a little bit and talk about the UN, and then I'll get back to talk a little about the UN, the who the UN is and why, and then I'll talk more about the UN Association, and then I'll talk about some specific actions that y'all could take that could make a little bit of difference in moving the needle. So I'm really honored to speak to you today about the vital role of the UN and the UN Association in its attempt to foster global cooperation and maintaining peace. The UN was founded in 1945, as many of you probably know, and it really still serves as a beacon of hope for a world united in its pursuit of shared goals. The central mission of the UN is maintaining international peace and security, not all that different from the religious communities blessing war and violence, and the purpose of the interfaith communities being united for justice and peace. So there's 193 member states of the UN. And the UN operates on the principles of diplomacy, dialogue, and collaboration. We may not always like that, because part of the structure of the UN, as leadership roles are on a evolving or ongoing basis, where different countries lead certain parts of the UN on a monthly or quarterly basis. Sometimes a country such as Iran might head the Human Rights Council of the UN, which many people would say, what? How could that be? And yet, in a world of fairness and diplomacy, having every country, whether we like them or not, having a real say in the matter is, at least theoretically, supposed to be helpful. It's arguable. The UN's impact is felt across various regions, but notably its work has been particularly significant in areas of humanitarian crisis. such as in Syria, Yemen, South Sudan, etc. And we could argue about the UN's effectiveness in those areas. When you look at the mess of what's going on in Yemen, for example, the peacekeepers do what they can, but the UN does not maintain an army. It cannot force a group or a government to be good global citizens. It can't force that. The guys in the blue helmets and the men and women in the blue helmets save US dollars, save US lives. The troops of the peacekeepers are all volunteer from other countries, not the US. They're serving millions of people food every day. As you all know, there's the greatest number of refugees currently than has ever been, over 80 million refugees currently. In terms of figures, the UN manages a budget of over $50 billion annually, allowing it to implement a wide array of programs addressing these various issues, from poverty and hunger, education, the environment, healthcare, etc. The UN has established the Sustainable Development Goals, 17 Sustainable Development Goals. I'll get into those in just a few moments. The UN's agencies like UNICEF and the World Food Program work to improve the lives of millions, demonstrating the tangible impact of multilateral cooperation. The UN provides many things that people don't realize. The UN gets in the news when a peacekeeper has been improper towards women, and some issues that have occurred around the world with regards to bad actions by some of the peacekeepers, or its ineffectiveness in terms of maintaining peace in some of the areas that I mentioned before, such as Yemen and Syria, etc. But the UN's work is very broad and very deep. The UN is responsible for international postage, for control of the international seas, for many things that we don't realize that might seem small or unimportant that the UN does. It provides food for over 90 million people in 80 countries. It vaccinates 58% of the world's children, saving over 3 million lives a year. The UN assists over 38.7 million refugees, actually now it's over 80 million refugees, people fleeing war, famine, persecution, and trying to get to water. The needs of people on the planet for water is getting, worse and worse. The amount of drinkable, usable, clean water is at an all-time low. People are moving around the planet to get to some water. And that also coincides with climate change. The UN works with 93 countries to combat climate change and make development sustainable. The UN keeps peace with over 120,000 peacekeepers in 17 operations on 4 continents. It fights poverty. The UN, and this is all just to give you a glimpse of some of the work the UN does. They help improve the health and well-being of 420 million rural poor in the world. The UN protects and promotes human rights through 80 treaties and declarations. Many people say these treaties or declarations aren't worth the paper they're written on, but I still say that in communication, anything can be worked out. Those treaties have a place, and the extent to which anybody listens to any of it makes a difference. And can you listen to more and attended to more, of course. The UN protects and mobilizes 22 billion in humanitarian aid to help people affected by emergencies, earthquakes, floods, etc. And the UN uses diplomacy to prevent conflict, assisting some 60 countries a year with their elections. And finally, the UN promotes maternal health, saving the lives of 30 million women a year. It just gives you a glimpse of some of the work of the UN, most of which goes quite unnoticed. One area where the UN shines is in the peacekeeping missions. Since its inception, the UN has deployed over 71 peacekeeping operations involving millions of personnel. These missions serve to mediate conflicts and protect civilians where possible, attempt to promote stability in these volatile regions. The peacekeeping of the UN has been instrumental in places like Cyprus, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Lebanon, although many of these places still are on the edge of tremendous problems. The value of these missions extends beyond immediate conflict resolution. They create conditions conducive to long-term development and prosperity, laying the groundwork for nations to rebuild and thrive. Through peacekeeping, the UN not only prevents violence, but also fosters the conditions for sustainable peace and development. And obviously, there's a lot of work yet to be done. All we have to do is read the paper any day and realize that. It's hitting us right between the eyes currently. So, as I mentioned earlier, the Sustainable Development Goals is one major area of focus for the UN and the U.N.A. The UN Association is composed of chapters like grassroots clubs around the country, and there's also UN associations throughout the world. The World Federation of United Nations Associations, WFUNA, is the world organization, and U.N.A. USA is the U.S. organization. We operate under the banner of the UN Foundation. Neither organization is part of the UN, never has been. The UN Association was created by Eleanor Roosevelt when she converted what was the League of Nations chapters. The League of Nations existed before the UN, and there were some grassroots clubs at that time that supported the work of the League of Nations and educated people in their local communities about the work of the League of Nations. When the League of Nations disbanded, Eleanor Roosevelt and others worked to convert those clubs to the UN Association. There are 13 chapters of the UN Association throughout Southern California, Santa Barbara, San Diego, San Fernando Valley, Los Angeles, Long Beach, Pomona Valley, Coachella Valley, Pasadena, I think I mentioned Inland Empire, Orange County, like that. There's chapters throughout Northern California and around throughout the country. There's about 3,000 members throughout Southern California and around 15,000 members nationally. These chapters work to put on programs to primarily educate and advocate about the work of the UN. And those events would usually include speakers from universities or other organizations talking, whether it be about women's rights, education, sanitation. I think a quarter of the world, like about 2 billion people, don't have adequate sanitation, don't have a bathroom, don't have a toilet, per se, as we know a toilet to be. So we provide programs on those speakers on those various topics. Sometimes they'll put on a car wash with using recycled water, or other programs that could enhance people's awareness of climate change, etc. So those chapters, as I said, I started with the UN Association in 2005. From being a board member, the Pasadena chapter invited me to be on their board. I became familiar with the regional offices, the regional board. They invited me to be a vice president for resource development, which is basically a fundraising position, which I didn't want to do as a fundraising position. I was already working with my clients' monies. I didn't really want to do that in my other role. But I had created venting events, and I thought, what about putting on some kind of program that gives people an opportunity to find out more about the UN and the UN Association and the work that we do by putting on an annual West Coast Global Forum. And so we started the Global Forums. I hosted and produced 14 Global Forums. The last one was officially was during the pandemic. And then it evolved to more of a regional, including Northern California climate event. But we had guest speakers. We focused on one of the Sustainable Development Goals usually. And we highlighted people in the community for their work. We honored the LA women's basketball team for their work mentoring women in the community. We honored the Foundation for Women and a couple of other women's organizations for their work in supporting women and fighting sexual abuse and the slave trade, if you will, of women, and supporting those situations or encouraging awareness of those situations. So the UN Association has been very active with the Sustainable Development Goals, and I'll share my screen for a moment and share those goals with you. So this is a website, globalgoals.org. I invite you to make a note of that. If any of these goals speak to you, get tons of information about each of these 17 Sustainable Development Goals, the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And if any of you are interested, I can send you a postcard that, I don't know if it'll show up on the screen, but maybe not. Yeah, I can send you a postcard with the 17 goals and a little bit of explanation about those goals. So if you've got my email address, I can send you that postcard. But just briefly going through the goals, I won't elaborate. Goal number 1 is no poverty. Goal number 2, and by the way, poverty, since the establishment of these goals, poverty has been reduced about 25%. Zero hunger, also significantly reduced since the goals were produced, but still a problem. Good health and well-being, quality education, gender equality, clean water and sanitation, affordable and clean energy, decent work and economic growth, industry, innovation, and infrastructure, reduced inequalities, sustainable cities and communities, responsible consumption and production, climate action, life in the water, life on land, peace, justice, and strong institutions, and partnerships for the goals. Prior to the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, there were the 8 Millennium Development Goals, which many of you may have heard of. So the MDGs transitioned in 2005 to the SDGs, 17 of them. Many people said, well, how could you have a program with 17 goals? That's way too many. You got to focus. But also the members of the UN, particularly on the committee, and these were not just decided by the committee. These the UN held conferences around the country. I attended one here in Southern California, where all the input of the people attended was compiled and put together for the creation of what became the 17 SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals. And one of the reasons was that the Millennium Development Goals mostly pointed to what those other countries need to do. And the SDGs actually reflect things that we need to do right here in our own borders, in our own towns. As much as it said what other countries needed to do, it really illustrated and emphasized what we need to do. So just some basics, and these are, I'll get back to some other comments about the U.N.A. and the UN specifically, but just some actions that we could all take that are very reasonable and very easy. So for example, there's a sheet here, The Lazy Person's Guide to Saving the World. And I'll share just a couple of steps from a couple of the things that a lazy person could do. Things you could do from your couch. Save electricity by plugging appliances into power strip and turning them off completely when not in use. from your couch, share interesting social media posts about women's rights or climate change. From your couch, follow your local news, track the global goals online at Global Goals UN. All right. Things you could do from home. If you're getting up from the couch, still, what could you do from home? Air dry. Let your hair and clothes dry naturally. Wash full loads. Take short showers instead of baths. Freezing fresh produce and leftovers will save food and money. Start heating food right when you turn on the oven. Avoid preheating. Adjust your thermostat lower in the winter, higher in the summer. If those are a few things you could do from home. And things you could do from outside the house. These are all things that anybody could do. Doesn't cost anything. Shop local. Keeps people employed and prevents trucks from driving far distances. Shop for sustainable seafood. Bike, walk, or take public transport. Bring your own bag when you shop. Donate what you don't use. And in capital letters, things you could do from outside your house, vote. And if anybody would like a copy of the Lazy Person's Guide to Saving the World, I'll be happy to send that as well. So, you know, I could just touch on some of what the UN does. We could spend a whole 3-day weekend conference talking about the various departments and roles and administration of the UN. There's been attempts, and there are ongoing attempts to restructure or reorganize the UN in certain ways, perhaps adding people to the various councils, the Security Council, that one country can veto anything at all, whether it be China, Russia, or the US, and how that impedes making a better world. You know, the need to create some kind of equality that where still every voice is respected and heard, but doesn't necessarily yank the UN in every which direction. Challenges persist. The UN relies on the support of organizations like yourselves, like the UN Association, to bridge gaps and amplify its impact. The U.N.A., through its advocacy and outreach, plays a crucial role in engaging civil society, promoting awareness, and garnering support for UN affiliates and UN initiatives. Together, we form a powerful partnership that transcends borders, working towards a more just and peaceful world. That's the intention. We got a long way to go. In conclusion, the United Nations and the UN Association are indispensable pillars of global cooperation. As we navigate an ever-changing world, we need to recognize the importance of these institutions in fostering a world, an improved world, in fostering dialogue, addressing women's issues, various crises that take place, building a future where the principles of peace and cooperation prevail. My website, Conversations for Peace, includes 15 episodes of interviews that I conducted starting 6 years ago. As a kid growing up, as I mentioned, in Portland, Oregon, I was always, my entire life, headlines about strife in the Middle East. Always, always, always strife in the Middle East. And so I decided to do that project where I went to Israel and I began interviewing people on what would be possible if everybody could get along. I interviewed the mayor of Haifa. I interviewed the president of Rotary International in Jerusalem. I interviewed a rabbi in the West Bank who his story was incredible. He says that about 15 or 20 years ago now, he had been a settler about 35 years ago. And about 15 years ago, he had an epiphany where he suddenly realized that all these other people around, and I'll get to your question in just a moment, Steve, where he suddenly realized that all these people that were around were actually people, referring to the Palestinians in the West Bank. And he began meeting them and having meetings with them so that they could discover who he is and he could discover who they are. And he and his Palestinian friend now travel the world sharing what they're doing and what they're creating. They have a school now with Jewish and Muslim, Arab and Palestinian and Israeli kids to go to school together. And he has many other programs encouraging understanding between the people in the community. I asked him if he gets any support from the government, from the Israeli government for his efforts. He laughed. He said no. And, you know, I interviewed a business manager. I interviewed a Palestinian lawyer in the South, Atwa, beautiful man, wonderful guy. I interviewed a woman that ran an office for Landmark Education, Landmark Worldwide in Tel Aviv, a wonderful Hajar, a beautiful, wonderful Palestinian woman, about her work in working for an organization that was committed to a world that works for everyone, with a capital E, everyone. And you know, she was an amazing Palestinian woman who had a hard time getting an apartment in Tel Aviv. And you know, the one question that I asked everyone, what would be possible if everybody could get along? They couldn't speculate. Not one of them could speculate. They have never known it. It's always been a struggle. There's always been, you know, we're all children of Abraham, as far as I understand the old stories. We're all children of Abraham. One wife, one daughter went this way, one daughter went that way, but we're all children of Abraham, as far as I know from my Sunday school teachings. And yet the heels are dug in. Your God's better than my God, or some form of that. More people have died because my God's better than your God. And that really, you know, as I say in my first episode of my Conversations for Peace project about everybody getting along in the Middle East and in Israel, you've all been there they've all been there for thousands of years. You go back to a certain date and time, and it was the Romans or the Palestinians or the Hebrews. But you go back 3,000 years, it was basically, you know, whoever it was. Who cares? You're all there now. Work it out. We're adults. There's got to be a way to put the past in the past and see, well, here we are now. What are we doing to ourselves? This killing is not helpful to anybody. And it only has people dig in their heels. So I invite you all to check out my episodes of Conversations for Peace. Episode 5 has an interview with a woman named Vivian Silver. I interviewed her when I got back from Israel. She lived near Gaza, and I couldn't interview when I was in Israel, but we did a split screen interview with her when I got back. The beginning of the interview, you hear air raid warnings, you hear missile warnings. And she mentions that she may need to run down to the shelter, but for right now, it's okay. So we continued the interview. She was an amazing woman who stood for peace. She worked with senior Palestinian leadership and Israeli leadership to create a peace, politically negotiated settlement. And now her kibbutz was invaded and she was burned to death. And it's just, the mess on both sides is atrocious. What happened in October is unforgivable, and what's happening right now in Gaza is unforgivable. It needs to stop. People need to somehow, or the leadership seems to get more out of it by keeping it this way. And that's what bothers me. And that's hopefully the UN at some point can get more of a spine and be a bit more effective in bringing the world some peace. So I really thank you. I appreciate your interest in a peaceful world, in stopping blessing war and violence, and in creating an environment for peace. I thank you for your commitment to a world that works for everyone, and thank you for your attention today. I see a few hands up. Steve?
Well, Barry, this was remarkable. I usually, as chair, wait till the end of a speaker's presentation at 9:30 to say, you are now a card-carrying member of ICUJP, but you have fully qualified for that membership by your remarks so far. I must tell you that I was a little worried this would be a kumbaya talk, extolling purely and only extolling the virtues of the UN. And I want to say that the first part of your talk is very important, and I learned a lot. And I know many people here in our group try to stay informed. We try to read and study, and the breadth and depth of the everyday work for those 17 goals, and really improving people's lives, feeding people every day. That's the essential first step to justice and peace. You're not going to enjoy justice and peace if you can't get a square meal and have a healthy home to live in, etc. So that was very important, and that it goes to the heart of much of what ICUJP believes in. But the second part of your talk, and what you came to just now, I was already framing my question when you said, when is the UN going to get a spine? There are resolutions that the occupation and settlements are illegal. These have been long-standing UN resolutions. And yet, in this modern period, I'll use October 7 as the shortest recent period, but for decades, and whether it's my ignorance, and you may tell me that the UN is doing something about this, but it feels anemic. It feels as if they can pass paper resolutions, and meanwhile, people are dying, and terrible war crimes are being committed. So I would break my question into two parts. Are we missing anything from what the UN has actually done? And I'm going to confine this to the Middle East and the Israeli-Palestine conflict. What are we overlooking? If they pass these resolutions, are they attempting to enforce those resolutions? So what are we missing? And secondly, what can your associations do across the country as a lobbying force, not just to extol the virtues of the UN and be a cheerleading organization, but to actually play a role in engaging the UN and helping them to grow a spine?
It's a great question, and I'll share my thoughts on it. And I think that in terms of how can the UN Association or us personally as individuals or other organizations like the ICUJP push the needle a bit and move the needle. I hate to say what I've heard said by so many people, is to say that it's complicated, and it is complicated, but so what? That's maybe a bit of a convenient excuse. Companies and organizations have taken on complicated issues and found a way to move them and evolve, and in an ever-changing world, you have to do that. I think that in some respects, for me personally, in my personal opinions, it kind of boils down to the local leadership and the local people. If the people are not able to rise up because of pressure on them in their lives, leadership needs to have that incentive. I personally think that leadership in the entire world, almost 100%, is probably the lousiest global leadership I've seen in my lifetime, and I'm 72 years old. The political leadership in this country, the political leadership in Israel, I've never personally been a fan of Netanyahu. You cannot keep a people under your thumb forever and ever and not expect it to explode. And the attempts to create a homeland for the Palestinians has been at best weak and not really a commitment. of either side, it seems, either side. When the Palestinians, through Yasser Arafat, had opportunities for a peace settlement, they scuttled that opportunity. And there's been very rare leadership in Israel that was strongly supportive of the creation of a Palestinian state. At some point, how can you have a quote unquote Jewish state and a democracy? Now, there are Palestinians that are at high levels of government in Israel, educators, doctors, professors at numerous levels in Israel. I don't understand. I guess when Israel was created, many of the people that left, they want to come back. That's the right of return. I don't know how that would ever be worked out. Personally, it would be wonderful. It's a tough question for me to answer fairly, Steve. I think that the leadership of the Palestinians and the leadership of Israel need to have a major transformation, and I don't see that happening anytime soon. I think part of this news yesterday that Israel knew about this potential attack that took place on October 7th, that they knew about it a year ago and didn't give it any credibility is shocking. And I don't know if that story is accurate or not. If it's accurate, it's pretty shocking that they wouldn't give it any time of day. You know, people have a right to exist in peace. The government of Israel has a right to protect its citizens and its country. And at the same time, there should be, I believe, a Palestinian state. And whether it's a two-state solution of Gaza and the West Bank, I don't personally fully even understand the two-state solution idea, but nonetheless, the Palestinians should have a state. And most Palestinians, like most Israelis, get along great. And yet, this need to keep heels dug in and hatred existing and a denial of a country's existence isn't going to work. So there's work to do. And I pray that better leadership somehow or other comes forward. So that's my best answer at this point.
A quick follow-up to the first part of my question. Are you able, for the benefit of everybody on this call and in the recording, and we post our talks, are you at, I don't know if it's at your fingertips, to summarize the UN resolutions that have declared occupations and settlements illegal and have made other statements regarding Israel's oppression of Palestinians? And have they done anything to enforce those resolutions?
No.
I don't believe there's been. I haven't read anything pertaining to enforcing any of those resolutions. And that's one of any number of resolutions, like you talked about, like I mentioned, that's written on paper that's not worth the paper it's written on. Is there any real meat, any real bite to these resolutions? That one or any others, any number of others. This leads to the ineffectiveness of the UN. It's great that the UN exists as the only kind of international body that countries have, in a sense, in common membership. But at the same time, the ineffectiveness has become really, I would say, very, very, very problematic to the continuation of the UN as we know it. Let's see, Dave, I think your hand was up next. Dave Clennon. You can unmute and share your question, Dave.
Yes. I'm here fumbling with the mouse. So I want to, well, first of all, I want to thank you for a piece of advice that you gave, namely to avoid preheating your oven I'm basically a busboy and a dishwasher in our house, but I will try to convince my wife that that she doesn't need to preheat the oven before she begins to bake or roast our meal. So I thank you for that. I want to address something that you said about Israel-Palestine. You characterized it as a religious conflict, and I just want to mention that as an Irish American, I always bridled when people said the conflict in Northern Ireland is Protestant versus Catholic, because it was much more a matter of invaders and settlers versus an indigenous population, in my opinion. So I submit that the conflict in Palestine-Israel is not a religious conflict. It's a political conflict. It's a conflict over land. It's a military conflict. There's an extreme political military imbalance between the two parties. And finally, it's a conflict between the indigenous population of historic Palestine and European settlers who immigrated, or more contentiously, who infiltrated or invaded the land of historic Palestine. So in the light of that, what do you think of the United Nations forming and sending a peacekeeping mission to Israel, Palestine? Is there any possibility that the United Nations could intervene to keep the peace and perhaps arrange for a power sharing arrangement until the issues of land and political and military power could be resolved? Thank you.
Great, very interesting points that you mentioned, Dave. I thank you very much for that. I agree that it's not so much a religious issue, really, as it is a political and economic issue, and it needs to be worked out politically. And I differ a little bit in terms of the indigenous, as I mentioned in my first episode of my Conversations for Peace project, episode number 1, where I mentioned both peoples have been there for thousands of years. If you want to only go back to the mid-40s and when Israel was created, and you had thousands of people, millions of people perhaps coming down from Europe, escaping the Holocaust, etc., and moving into what was the newly created official country of Israel. Prior to that, there was no country. It was under British mandate for many years, or under Roman or other Babylonian or other historical, I'll say, occupation. To me, the indigenous people are the Hebrews and the Arab, or whatever the Arab community was called at that time in a few thousand years ago. And in fact, I just did on Thanksgiving Eve a globally streamed concert for peace, highlighting the contribution of indigenous communities, mostly focused on First Nation Canadians and Native Americans, but also included a musical representation of indigenous communities in New Zealand and in Africa and other places. So the indigenous peoples seem to be always pushed to the edge wherever they are historically. And whether it was the white man coming to the US and pushing the Indians aside, or whether it was other the Romans coming into the area of what became the country of Israel and pushing Jews aside, or the Spanish Inquisition, or whatever other time you want to talk about. It's just an unfortunate part of our history as humans on this planet that can't seem to leave well enough alone. And to stop, the old expression, when you cross the street, when you're a kid, stop, look, and listen. We don't do that. We need to stop, look, and listen to other people. I have a hard time, I'll admit it, I have a hard time listening to some of the views that I hear on one of our particular biased news stations. But to try to at least bend an ear for a moment and try to hear another point of view. We've all become so determined in our point of view as I'm right, you're wrong. And whenever I point a finger at you and accuse you of being wrong, there's three fingers pointing back at me. And I have to really take a look at that and pay attention to that. And what are my accusations really doing for me or for the world? So I guess in an answer to your question, Dave, and I don't know if it's an answer, but I do agree that it's a political conflict situation. Both sides need to recognize the other's existence, the other's right to exist, and I don't believe that Iran is helping. I don't believe that Iran's support of Hamas or Hezbollah, if the intention is really to eliminate the country of Israel and eliminate the country of Israel, I don't think that's going to work. And I personally hope it does not work. I do hope that there will be a country for the Palestinians to live and be happy and create a beautiful country, and to be accepted and to be able to come and go freely in Israel. My friend Vivian Silver, may she rest in peace, in addition to being a major peace activist working with high levels of both sides, would also in her day-to-day work helped get Palestinians that in the West Bank and in Gaza that had cancer. She helped them arrange transportation to get from Gaza to hospitals in Israel for cancer treatment and back and forth. That was one of her primary tasks day to day. And
I'm sorry to interrupt, but my question was, what is the advisability and what is the feasibility of the United Nations Security Council, General Assembly, whatever body would make that decision? What is the advisability and the feasibility of sending a peacekeeping mission? It would have to be a very large force. But what is the advisability and the feasibility of sending a peacekeeping force to Israel-Palestine? Thank you.
Yeah, sorry, Dave. I think that would be a great idea. It may be premature just because of the level of the heat right now, but I think it would be a very good idea to have such a buffer zone, such a force of that a peacekeeping mission might be able to provide. I don't think that people living for 50 years in refugee camps is useful to anyone. And these refugee camps need to be evolved into, people living in a place where they can live and create lives and not be in some kind of imprisoned form of situation. So whether it be, so I would agree that a peacekeeping missions would be useful. In the refugee camps, most of them are fed and schooled by UN-backed schools. And as you probably know, but I think in terms of a short answer to your question, Dave, I would totally agree that, is it feasible? I personally say it's feasible, but maybe not yet until the heat is turned down a bit. They don't have an offensive army. They can't go in and with tanks and missiles and start fighting a war per se. They're there to be peacekeepers. So there's probably some gap between here and the usefulness of the peacekeeping mission. And how about a question from, I think Lucy was next, I think, but I'll go across my screen as I see it. Go ahead,
Thank
Lucy.
you.
Could I ask that people keep their questions and also keep the answers short enough so that everybody with their hand up can have some time?
Yes, thank you. Sorry.
Thank you, Barry, for your presentation. It was really wonderful and expansive. And to Dave's question about the feasibility and the advisability, I remember seeing an interview with a UN peacekeeper one time. I believe he was from France with his beautiful French accent. And he said, there are not enough of us to keep the peace. We are here to be helpful, but we cannot keep the peace. Keeping the peace is up to you in your neighborhood. So I always think of how difficult it is for me to love my neighbor who I have an issue with. And yet that is in Leviticus, love your neighbor. It goes all the way back there. And so I just, I guess it's more of a comment than the question. I wanted to add, though, that this in World War I, apparently the British had what was called a Palestinian Brigade. And the Palestinian Brigade was composed of Arabs and Jews. And at the time, they were both called Palestinians. So I guess I'm having trouble articulating my question. It's just they apparently got along and fought in World War I altogether. And why is it so hard? You keep saying about digging in our heels. I guess that's the bottom line. We just have to be willing to get along. Our neighbor is the Samaritan, it says in the New Testament, and the most hated person at the time, I guess. So thank you for your lazy man's help to bring this all forward. I don't know if I asked the question or not, but
Well,
I should say
it does start here. It does start in my own heart, in my own words, in my own relationship to people. Do I get mad at people or rude and impatient with people from time to time when a repair person doesn't show up when they're supposed to? And, is that really the end of the world, Barry? Do you really have to get that annoyed? You're not having cancer treatment today, thank God. You're not dodging missiles today, thank God. Okay, so somebody's a little bit late in getting there. Big deal. But we don't operate. I can say that now, but in 20 minutes, if I get a phone call, I could be annoyed, So it does start here. Absolutely. And I thank you for your comment and what I hear in your compassion and how you share yourself.
thank you.
We're all on this little planet spinning around, and we should be able to get along. We should be able, I think, respect each other and attempt to understand each other. There's a great short film called Admissions. Many of you may have seen it. And it's about a suicide bomber and an Israeli couple that got blown up in a cafe. And it's really, really well done. I highly recommend it. It really expresses the experience of both sides. And also a movie called Wrestling Jerusalem. Very excellent short film. Both are short movies, maybe half an hour each. And I highly recommend them.
Thank you.
I'm going to repeat. Please keep the question. We've got 5 hands up. 6
Okay,
hands, 7
I'll keep my answers short.
and
Rick.
please keep the questions short.
Rick.
Thank you, Barry. This has been great. Just a point of order. I have to remember the late great George Carlin. you cannot preheat an oven. It's heated or unheated. So just bear that in mind. But I did want to ask with the with the involvement of the association, are you guys working with also some of the UN entities regarding things like the annual days that they do? There's one coming up for victims of genocide. Today is World's AIDS Day. That is something that we would like to be able to also do as far as forums, and as far as maybe getting a different view of some of the work that we're doing around things like help for the unhoused in the area, and other aspects of the torture as well, with our Guantanamo program. I wanted to see if that was a connection that you normally have, and if we can be involved in that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Most chapters of the UN Association around the country, and especially here in Southern California, do events around those international days. International Day of Peace, I think, was in October. I hosted and produced an international concert for peace around that time, around the 17th of October. And also Human Rights Day, December 10th, is something that many chapters hold events around. And then it's up to the chapters. If there are events on International Women's Day, I think is in perhaps February. I'm not
March.
March. And the Environmental Day is I thought that was also in March, maybe not. April 22nd, something like that. And I appreciate that you know those dates off the top of your head. My mind is a little bit mushy this morning. But yes, and I would recommend, if you are in those areas of any chapter, go to UNA-SoCal.org, find a chapter in your neighborhood, join that chapter. It's very nominal, very, very reasonable. I think it's $40 or $50 a year. I'm a lifetime member, so I don't pay annual dues anymore. Find a local chapter, either join the chapter or send them an email, find out about what they're doing and check out something, and then maybe join. But yes, there's numerous events around the year on those kinds of days that you're referring to. How about a question from Sophia?
Yeah, my question is, how do we deal? No one here on this call or other people around the world think like Netanyahu. I think regime change is the only way to deal with Israel, because Israel's not acting the way we would want them to act, because they have a failed leader who's a dictator. And my concern has to do with the ceasefire. At the convention, I spoke with Adam Schiff that we shut down, which I'm really pleased about. We had our nomination convention, the Democratic Party in California. We were able to shut it down. But I challenged him looking at the concept of ceasefire, because the Arab nations have already talked about going against Israel. 2 Arab nations already voted to go against war if a certain mosque is attacked or bombed. So the term ceasefire, I think, is very critical for all people, not regardless of what party you believe in. If that mosque is hit, it could be the end of life as we know it, because the Arab nations will respond. And so that is my concern. Is there a way that we can talk about ceasefire? Because on the ground, I believe you have the right to defend yourself. But when we're talking about missiles, that there's technology that can also veer a missile. It hit that mosque, it could be catastrophic for all of us. So is there somewhere where we can start using language about not using missiles that could possibly harm people, of course, but specifically the spiritual space that all Arab nations have said they would rise up to protect? That's my my question for you, if you have any way of framing that.
Other than agreeing with you that the sooner that there's a regime change in Israel, the better, I can't really respond to much more of the rest of your question. Particularly, I'm not that well versed in the military aspect. I know that or which mosque you might be referring to. There's a major mosque that was built on top of what had been historically a Hebrew or Jewish temple. I don't know if that's the mosque you're referring to, but nonetheless, either way, religious sites like that should not be involved in receiving any kind of missiles or any kind of attack. And Netanyahu, it would be nice if Netanyahu would be replaced as soon as possible. From the Israeli population generally that I knew growing up to what it became the last 10, 15 years, are as like two different countries.
Mm-hmm.
And I attribute a lot of that to to Netanyahu.
Thank you.
He's never been a peacemaker.
And I think that's what we're dealing with. He's not acting like the rest of the world wants him to act, and he never will. And that's what we're dealing with.
Right. And just in all fairness, I think we need peacemakers on all sides.
Yes, I agree.
So let's see here. Next question from iPhone. Is that the young lady there that has the name iPhone on the screen, or I'll go to the next person?
Well, that's Carol Francis.
Oh, Carol Francis.
Really? Oh, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Okay. Thank you. First of all, when you talk about Iran's support for Hamas, I think we should also talk about a greater problem, and that's the U.S. support of Israel, unequivocal support. We talk about indigenous people. Yes, the Palestinians and the Jews who lived there for millennia are the indigenous people, and the Europeans, Jews who came in later are definitely the colonial forces. But I wanted to add, and you mentioned that Jews have lived there.
I think Carol Francis is
what? Way before 2,000 years ago.
Go ahead.
What?
Go ahead,
Hello?
Carol. Go ahead, Carol.
Am I?
You're doing fine.
Okay. We talk about the Jews lived there 2,000 years ago, but like Eric Fromm, a European Jew, said, later American Jew, that if we all said that everybody can go back and take over the lands their ancestors lived in 2,000 years ago, the world would be a bigger mess than it is now. But I wanted to ask about the UN Security Council and the veto. I mean, I think that's the main problem with the United Nations is the veto power. And what country has used the veto power the most? Apparently, it's been the United States.
Well, that may be. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I would imagine that if you added Russia and China together and compared that with the U.S., you'd probably have pretty much an equal number. Is my guess. I have no evidence of that, but at least not at my fingertips. But in terms of a revision or reorganization of the UN, adding some members to the Security Council, revising the structure to some extent, I think would be useful. So,
but if you add people, but the U.S. could still veto.
Well, then maybe you need.
What's the matter if you add 193 countries to it, but one country could still veto it? It doesn't seem very democratic to me.
Well, maybe you need to have, if you more of a democratic balance. It needs to be a majority vote, not just a one country to vote. So they haven't asked my opinions on how they should structure the UN, but nonetheless, I think a more democratic approach would make sense.
Thank you.
When the UN was formed, it was basically formed with mostly, let's say, good global citizens. I'll use that phrase. It's arguable to say good global citizens, but there was maybe like around 50 countries that signed on to the original and now it's 193. So you have a lot of countries there. If every country just had one vote and that was it, they would vote to ban the U.S. from the UN probably. And the people that are here with the UN in New York, they get a lot of perks being in the U.S. and live a much better life than many of them would live in their own country. So I'm not sure where the UN goes from here, but it does need to be reorganized in many ways, and that would be the Security Council would be a major place for that reorganization to start.
Barry, Anthony Manousis has had his hand up for a while.
Let's go with Anthony. Thank you. Thank you for your patience, Anthony.
No problem. Thank you, Steve, for noticing. And thank you, Barry, for your excellent presentation. And, as a Quaker, the Quakers have supported the UN even long before it started. William Penn actually came up with the idea of having something like the UN in Europe. So it's a great idea, a great ideal. And it has had some significant success, like with relief efforts and educational work. And I think as also serving as kind of a conscience of the world. It would be an enormous loss to the world not to have the UN. However, as we've been talking, it's had some limitations. And one of the questions arose earlier related to the peacekeeping forces of the UN and how effective they might be in Israel-Palestine. So my question is, has there been a study or done about the effectiveness of the UN peacekeeping forces in other parts of the world? What's its track record, and how could it become a more effective force?
That's a great question. I don't have information at my fingertips on the track record of the peacekeepers, but I can get some of that information to you, and I'd be happy to do that. How about if I get that information, forward it to Rick, and he can forward it to you, Anthony?
Well, actually, it'd be good to share it with our listserv. I think we'd all like to know about it. And I'm also thinking of it in the context of the Nonviolent Peace Force, which makes an effort to resolve conflicts in different zones. But I'd love to hear what the UN peacekeeping force has done, and please share that with all of us so we can assess its effectiveness.
Yeah, and if I get that, I can also put a link to it in the YouTube video that'll come from this, and also send it out to the group.
Thank you, Rick.
Let me look at something here. So this is an example of a peacekeeping mission that took place. The UN Security Council authorized peacekeeping because of a lack of state authority in Cote d'Ivoire. In 2004, the country was divided in half by a civil war. During the 2010 presidential election crisis, 3,000 Ivorians were killed and 300,000 became refugees. What we did, the UN deployed over 6,000 peacekeepers in 2004 and increased them to 11,792 by 2011. So in 7 years, they were still working there, even a larger force. They disarmed 70,000 combatants and reintegrated them into society. 2 presidential and legislative elections were overseen in 2011 and 2016. Opposition participated for the first time in the 2016 elections. Over 250,000 refugees returned by 2016, strengthened the National Commission on Human Rights and helped decrease human rights violations. Violations were 1,726 in 2011 and only 88 in 2016, and supported social cohesion through 1,000 quick impact projects. Intercommunal conflicts were decreased by 80%. And the Ivorian administration was now present in all 108 local departments, and that what contributed to the peacekeeping mission being completed. So that's just one example of the intricate work that the peacekeepers do.
Barry, I want to thank you for that. That was really impressive. I also want to say I'd never heard that. It's so interesting that our media would have covered something like UN peacekeeper caught, having sex with an Ivorian, right? That
Right.
would have been like front page news. But the successful effort like this gets buried, God knows where. I never heard of this. And there are probably other examples like it. We just need to publicize this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And so
This
people
is
feel that there's some hope.
well.
I mean,
This
when you said something about the peacekeeper force in Gaza, my thought was, would it work? Well, maybe it could. It worked there. Maybe it could work in Gaza. So that's
yeah.
really important. Publicizing successful efforts at diffusing conflict needs to be shouted from the rooftops.
I agree with you, Anthony. It's a great question and a great area for further conversation. The all I did was Google success of peacekeeping missions and scroll down and just picked one of the articles, and that's what happened to show up. I didn't look for that specific story, and but that meant somebody had to do a search. It's not going to be in the news. If it like the story goes, if it bleeds, it leads, and if and unfortunately, sometimes the darker the population involved, the less media it gets in this country. And that's a very sad, unfortunate, seeming reality. I think it's unfortunate, and there needs to be a distinction between, like, I'm a Jewish kid. I support the existence of Israel. I do not support its policies. And by not supporting its policies, many people would consider me anti-Israel, when I'm not. Or if somebody doesn't support Israel, especially currently, they're painted with a broad brush as being anti-Semitic, which they're also not necessarily. They might be. There is a lot of anti-Semitism, just as there's a lot of racism in the world. And, that's unfortunate that both of those should exist at all. But it's the media, and as a result, I'd say most people do not distinguish between Israel's policies and, I'll say, the Israeli people. The Israeli people, Palestinian people, Muslim, Arab, Jewish, whatever combination you want to look at, they seem to interact quite well and get along quite well. But it's the policies of the leadership of both communities that continue to foster this animosity. That's my thought on that. So could there be better media coverage that's more fair and balanced and defines the difference between supporting Israel and being that doesn't, and not supporting Israel does not mean you're anti-Semitic, unless you are in favor of the elimination of the country. So I'll leave it at that. Dr. Ruby.
Yes.
There you
Now,
go.
okay, the screen came up so I could unmute before I couldn't. Yes, I do remember you. And it was some of your outside work. Too. It wasn't just agape. And, I was grateful for that type of work and for learning about some of the things that I needed to know about for what I felt, which would be the world coming together in peace. And I call it peace power. And what I was wondering, you said quite a few different things that the UN is involved in, but I didn't hear simple future projections. If you can understand what I meant, and I'm thankful for what you Anthony, what you brought up, and what he expressed. That was partially, but this is what I'm looking at now. What are the simple future progressions? Mine is not teaching youth that war is worthy, or that going forward with knowing that there's peace power. There's a way to transfer different things and have fun with it. One young man I was speaking with, I told him my email says no toy gun. And he said, well, what would we do about guns? I mean, we need guns, and I expressed to him, what would we do, or how would we do it? He didn't have another way, because this is what his gentrification has been, and probably his parents and grandparents, is that war is the only way. And for me, can be anger, instead of transferring another way. No matter what comes up, just taking a breath. So what are the simple future projections for the UN? And I pass.
If you're talking projections in terms of how fewer people will be hungry, or how many more people will have a toilet, how many more acres will be fertile and growing food and vegetables versus being arid. If you're talking about those kinds of goals, those are all part of the projections that are in the Sustainable Development Goals. So I would invite you to go to that globalgoals.org page, and each one of those goals has goals included in the information shared there for each of the goals. So whether it be eliminating hunger by 95% or by 2030, so each of those goals has endpoints or intentions of what they'd like to reach to see that goal satisfied. And
one thing I see that wasn't mentioned for me was positive trade.
Positive trade,
yes,
would be, I think, in goal 17, in terms of partnerships and sustainable living, is goal 15 or 16, 17. I think those refer to trade and doing business with local organizations. And, I do a lot of work as an investment broker with clients invested in a mutual fund from a company called Calvert. Calvert's one of the first and only socially responsible mutual fund companies where somebody can make their investments in companies that are in mutual funds that are focused on companies that don't make missiles, don't sell alcohol, don't sell tobacco products, etc., or greener companies. GE contacted them once to see what do they need to do to be included in their portfolios. And they said, you make missiles, you'll never be included in our portfolios. So there are companies out there that stand for a better world, cleaner world. But it can take, unfortunately, some digging around to find it. As Anthony pointed out, it's not easy to find the positive news. Let's see here.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome, Dr. Ruby. Thank you. And I always appreciate, the cover story many years ago of a Jewish journal newspaper with Michael Beckwith on the cover. What attracted so many Jewish people to Agape, like what attracted so many people to Marianne Williamson and the Course in Miracles. It's one of the things that I've appreciated about my Jewish upbringing is to look at the other and learn from, and not push away, but to learn from and appreciate other opinions. So anyway, Sophia, how about a question?
What I hear also is the unification, no matter the colors or the nationalities or
That's
what
right.
the choice is, religion or not religion, the right answer is in each and every one.
That's right. I think episode 10 and 11, perhaps, of my Conversations for Peace project are with Black women who lost a son due to police violence. One was killed by an LAPD officer. The other one was killed by an unknown assailant. But it talks about how she dealt with that loss and how she recovered from it, and or attempted to recover from it. So the conversations were not only about Israel, but evolved into other areas. In fact, interviewing at the UN, wonderful women that were part of a Muslim sorority in Texas, the first and only, as far as I know, a Muslim sorority in the U.S. So it's they were all working for the possibility of a world that works. Sophia?
Well,
Yes.
we're getting down to closing time. So,
Last
Sophia,
one.
is this a statement or is this a quick question?
It's well, I wanted to hear his thoughts on the term Hamas because it's a political party, and I think what can we do to save lives? And so, can we start using language that would say the October 7th Battalion or Revolutionary Guard to distinguish between those that rose up, against their oppressors? Because Netanyahu has said they're going to annihilate all of Hamas, and people within Hamas and that Democratic Party, which is a party, we have to start making that distinction. When I tell people that, it changes their way they look at Hamas. I said it's like if Democrats came up and all of a sudden they want to annihilate all Democrats or Republicans or whatever. I think the language is important, and if you can do anything with diplomacy to try and make the distinction, I think that would save lives. Do you agree?
Well, I agree that there should be better understanding of where these terms came from. I don't know where the name Hamas originated. I don't know where it originated, and nor do I know where the name Hezbollah originated. But I do know that or from what I've read, the number of Palestinians that have been killed by Hamas forces is a pretty staggering number as well. It doesn't make it right. But there's plenty of wrong on all sides, and I think that's important to recognize that that there's plenty of betterment of people's lives would be possible if we found a way to resolve conflict without having to resort to violence. That seems to be the easy way humans go to resolve violence. It'll be easier. There's a movie, just to wrap up, there's a movie called The Gods Must Be Crazy. Some of you probably have seen the movie. A bottle is thrown out of an airplane, and it lands in a little village in remote parts of Australia. And this tribe of people find this bottle, and they start playing with the bottle and spinning the bottle, and they find that they blow over it, it makes sound, so it becomes a musical instrument. And before long, somebody gets mad at somebody and hits them with the bottle, and now the bottle becomes a weapon. And so this great fun toy, which was a musical instrument, becomes a violent weapon. So humans, I don't buy that humans have always been at war and have to always be at war. What's been has been. To me, that does not have to determine our future. We have choice in the matter. That's one thing that I've learned in my life, in my studies. We have some choice in the matter. And what has been, has been. We can't change the clock on that, but we can transform our view of it, etc. So let's all go forward creating a better world and not have to be guided by the mess of the past. That's what I would say. You hear the music? Hi, I'm Barry Simon. Welcome to episode 5 of Conversations for Peace. As you know, over our episodes, we've been showing you various organizations and programs going on in the Middle East, primarily in Israel and the West Bank, that are providing opportunities for the possibility of peace to exist. And yet, every day, especially recently again, we're seeing missiles flying from Gaza, bombs coming from Israel, and more devastation for people on both sides. Right here in the States, we still have continually high school shootings taking place, or shootings in synagogues and churches and mosques. The willingness for people to commit violence versus have the headlines be all about creating a world of possibility and peace and cooperation, those kinds of headlines hardly exist at all. And yet that's what we're here to continue to support, the possibility of a world that works for everyone with no one left behind. In this episode, we'll be talking to Vivian Silver of the Women Wage Peace movement that we've seen pieces of in previous episodes.
I just have to warn you that we just got a security warning. I live right on the border of the Gaza Strip. I don't expect anything to happen, but I may have to run to my shelter, so we'll have to take a break. It's really crazy. At least they told us today. Yesterday, there was so much bombing, so much noise, and nobody was saying anything. We are made up of religious and secular. We're made up of right-wing, center, and left. We have set women as part of the movement, which is extraordinary. We have very different ideas about what the solution could be or should be, but we all agree on the one point that it has to be a political solution. Our goal here is to convince the people, create a critical mass of people in Israel who will pressure the government, because we believe that a political solution is the only way we're going to achieve security both in Israel and in Palestine. Women Wage Peace has proposed a bill that will hopefully be turned into law that calls for a political alternatives first. In other words, before the Israeli cabinet or government makes a decision to go to war, they will be obligated to consider and examine various political alternatives. We can all live together a beautiful life in this country, as long as our neighbors are also related to with dignity and self-determination. So we all deserve the same, and we all deserve better than we have now.
We shall live in peace today. Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe.
The work of Women Wage Peace continues. The legislation in the Knesset in Israel to forward the possibility of peace and cooperation among all people, ending this occupation as soon as possible.